The Vancouver Canucks are the toast of the NHL this season, but is it enough for Elias Pettersson? We'll find out. Plus, we will talk about Patrick Kane returning to Chicago to ruin Chris Chelios night for the Blackhawks organization, and Valeri Nichushkin set to return to the Avalanche. How big of a boost would that be for them down the stretch? We discuss all that and more on today's episode of the Locked On NHL podcast. We are your team every day.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into today's episode of the Locked On NHL podcast. We are your team every day, and we thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast platforms and on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On NHL is brought to you by Sleeper. You can download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. On today's episode of Locked On NHL, we discuss the latest in the Elias Pettersson contract negotiations. If you're a Vancouver fan, you may want to cover your ears for this one. We'll also talk about Patrick Kane back in Chicago in the other uniform and how he helped spoil a historic night for Chicago. And the Colorado Avalanche might be getting one of the biggest pre-trade deadline returns without even making a trade. All of that coming up on today's episode. My name is Seth Toupal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider and host of Locked On Wilds, here with my co-host for our Western Conference Tuesday edition, Nick Morgan of Locked On Predators. And Nick, we've got a full-packed show here today. And starting off with one that is going to cause a lot of spilled coffee, a lot of people trying to get themselves back on the road after nearly driving off of it, because it sounds as though it's not all set in stone that Elias Pettersson returns to the Vancouver Canucks, and he's in line for a mega extension. And this is one of those situations where, like, everything going right for Vancouver, and all of a sudden now you may have to worry about trying to figure out what to do if Elias Pettersson says, I know we're having a good season, but I still would like to go elsewhere once my contract is done.
I'm sorry, Canucks fans. I'm really sorry. You finally had something good going this year, and then this report comes out. Obviously, this is one of those things where you're going to have to take with a grain of salt. You're really going to have to, sort of sit back and see how this thing plays out. I mean, we've seen some, this person is for sure getting traded, or this person is for sure gone, or this person is for sure going to stay and re-sign, and only for them to get traded or for them to sign a big extension to stay, vice versa. We've seen a lot of situations that appear to be going one way that go the other thing. So let's start by saying that with Elias Pettersson, there's a lot of time left for him and the Canucks to work things out. It's interesting, though, that the Vancouver beat reporter, I cannot remember his name off the top of my head, but he was kind of the one that spearheaded this. But basically kind of said that according to the Canucks, Pettersson doesn't even have, I guess hasn't really, I'm trying to think of maybe the best way to say this, hasn't really been enthusiastic about contract negotiations. And maybe that's just where it is right now. But to his credit, or Pettersson's credit, defending him a little bit, it is the middle of the season.
Mm-hmm.
The Canucks are, appear to maybe be in a position to contend for the Stanley Cup. there could be a lot of things just going on right now. He could be a guy that just wants to focus on the hockey, maybe not worry about his long-term future, and that's fine. He's a restricted free agent. The Canucks have his rights. There appear to maybe be some, maybe they'll have time after the season to kind of sit down, see how the season ends, see if they're on the same page and make a decision to go from there. So I'm not hitting the doomsday button if I'm a Canucks fan just yet, Seth.
I agree, because there are a couple of different ways that Vancouver can handle this with the fact that they have Pettersson's rights next season. That's the key in this, is that they control his rights next season. And so you can either try to hammer out an extension in the offseason, or you can, you can go the route of, trying to just get like an arbitration, like a 1-year deal. But at that point, you have really, like, this to me is similar to how things played out with the Minnesota Wild and Kevin Fiala, where it got to that final year that the Wild had his rights. They go to arbitration because they really don't have the money to be able to work him into their long-term future. So they go to arbitration, but if anybody knows about how arbitration works, you are, as a team, making the case that you should be paying a player on your team less than they are asking for, which often leads to making the case for, yes, they're a good player, but. And that's the kind of thing that sticks with the player, to where that may be what eventually pushes them to the other side of the coin, where they're like, yeah, I don't want to stay. So I would say, if we're doing like a how hot is the burner type situation, it's on. I don't know necessarily that it's hot yet.
No, it's funny because to your, to the point you just made, here in Nashville, there is some kind of parallel with the Shea Weber situation from way back when, Weber was a restricted free agent twice. And going into that first arbitration, everybody was like, no harm, no foul. He's a restricted free agent. He's going to be here regardless. And then it got to them filing arbitration, and then it got to them actually going to an arbitration hearing. And then it got to, the judge having to come, or the arbitrator having to come down with a ruling. And it just seemed like there was, as they went through that whole process, it seemed like there was at least from the Shea Weber side, maybe some trepidation about coming back and coming back long-term and playing for that organization. Obviously he did, and obviously it worked out for another few years, but it wasn't exactly an easy task. And you just wonder, if you're Elias Pettersson, you go through that process again, do you want to go back to Vancouver? Is that going to be a thing, or are you going to be a little bit jilted at management? Are you going to be jilted at Patrick Allvin in the front office there about them not really, wanting to invest? The other thing is, just if you're Elias Pettersson, maybe you're not sold on the Canucks yet. Maybe you want to see how this season goes. So I don't know. There's a lot of factors at play here. It is going to be wild to see what happens over the next few weeks with the Pettersson situation. According to Elliot Friedman, teams are calling the Canucks right now. So who knows? Maybe we'll see just an out of nowhere Canucks trade here in a little bit.
And like, from a price tag perspective too, like, he is currently making, in the final year of his current deal, he's making $7.35 million. And all he's done since he signed that 3-year deal, kind of that bridge deal, he had 68 points in 2021, 2022, 32 goals, 36 assists. He had 102 points, including 39 goals in 2022-2023. He currently has 74 points in 60 games, including 29 goals. He's going to get, if he were to go somewhere else, he's getting a 10, 11 and a half per season. He's going to get a monster extension.
He's going to lock up that bag this summer, whether it's for the Canucks, whether it's for another team down the line. We'll have to see. But, this is the potential to become the story of the NHL over this next calendar year.
We've run the gambit here because we talked about it before the season. Like, is he going to want to stick around? And then all of a sudden it's like, looks like he's happy. Not necessarily.
Now he's not. Yeah.
Jeepers. Like, when the conversation should be about how good the Vancouver Canucks have been this season, it seems like this happens in sports all the time, where there just is something else that kind of takes the spotlight, and rightfully so, because this is like a kind of a doomsday clock situation for Vancouver Canucks fans. But again, the key thing for people to take away is that Vancouver does control his rights. So this is a situation that they have the entirety of the offseason to try to work out. But there will come a time in which there will have to be, if he doesn't budge, if he says, no, I'm not signing an extension, then there is going to become a point where they have to do something, because you can't just get to the end of the road, sign him to like maybe a 1-year deal, then he becomes an unrestricted free agent. And you're like, well, we tried. Like that's the kind of thing that loses front office executives their jobs.
Yeah.
So
it's going to be interesting.
Time will tell. So that's a big one that we'll keep an eye on. We have another that already happened. Patrick Kane still wearing red technically, but boy, that was weird seeing him on the other side of the ice against the Chicago Blackhawks. And so we'll talk about that. A night that was meant for celebration for Chris Chelios ended up in Patrick Kane stealing the show. Not surprised there. But we'll talk about that as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On NHL is brought to you by Sleeper. We are moving to the final couple of months of the NHL season, which means that it's playoff push time for many hopefuls throughout the season, which means you may see some of the top-level players in the NHL go absolutely nuts here down the stretch. That's a perfect opportunity for you to win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports, and especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. All you have to do is pick whether NHL players will record more or less than their Sleeper projections for things like goals, assists, saves, plus minus, and more in a given game. And I've had the opportunity to watch this trio up close over the last week. If you were to select Kirill Kaprizov, Joel Eriksson Ek, Matt Boldy, you get a real good chance to go over in pretty much every statistical category, and then you win big. You can set your entire lineup in under 60 seconds, and if you're a fan of other sports, you can play daily fantasy NFL, NBA, MLB, and college football on Sleeper too. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL, and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Welcome back to today's episode of the Locked On NHL podcast. Once again, we are your team every day, and we thank you for making Locked On NHL your first listen each and every day. Make sure if you haven't already, you subscribe so that you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the course of the week. We've got a wide panel of hosts throughout the week that bring you different angles for your favorite divisions, conferences, teams throughout the NHL. Nick, let's talk about what was supposed to be a night of celebration for the Chicago Blackhawks, Chris Chelios night.
Seemed like a lot of Blackhawks fans were still celebrating.
Yeah, they didn't let it ruin their time, but I just find it so funny that they were playing Detroit. Who plays for Detroit right now? Patrick Kane. If you missed it, he is a little bit of a notable figure in Chicago Blackhawks lore. A little bit of hardware. He's decorated, I think would be the best way to put it.
Seems to be a popular guy in the Blackhawks universe.
Yeah. How funny though that he was the one that scored the overtime goal against Chicago. Like, could you write it any better?
No. I mean, and it was, I don't know, like it was just a surreal scene from start to finish. First off, there was a lot of, I think some people, like, let's put it this way. If you're an old school Red Wings or Blackhawks fan, or you just kind of remember, hockey in the late 90s, early 2000s, when Chris Chelios got traded from Chicago to Detroit, he became the most hated person in Chicago. Like, that's like, David Ortiz going to play for the New York Yankees.
Ooh.
Like, that was how intense that rivalry was. Like, there was, I think like security had to stay outside his house in Chicago because of people messing with him. So I think there's a lot of people, a lot of people were saying, it's like, is it going to be that same kind of, vibe in Chicago, or are people going to be like, oh my God, why did it have to be Detroit? But, I love the standing ovation he got, during the, when they did like the intermission or TV timeout tribute to him. That was a good scene, and him doing laps back and forth because the round of applause was so long and so loud. And then when he scored that game-winning overtime goal, if you watch the replay, because I've watched this like 3 times already in the past 24 hours, if you watch that replay, look how many Blackhawks fans are like on their feet with their hands in the air. Like, you can see people like in that front row, like arms up, like ready to kind of cheer. And then they flash to the crowd, and everybody's clapping and stuff for him. So I don't know, like maybe it's just because the Blackhawks are kind of bottom feeders right now, and this the sort of energy isn't quite there, that why not, let's just go ahead and cheer for our former guy. But a surreal scene last night. And if you're Patrick Kane, boy, you couldn't have drawn that up any better.
I just love the Associated Press write-up on ESPN for this game because it reads the following. Patrick Kane and Alex DeBrincat connected for 2 big goals at the United Center. Same as it ever was, just in a different uniform.
Yeah.
Like, that is, as somebody who is a journalist by trade, I nerd out over stuff like that. Like, when you put something together, like just a succinct little couple 2 sentences that is just right below like all the video highlights of the game. I said to myself, I was like, that's well done. Like, that's a good job by whoever put that together. But we see this in sports a lot. It seems like it's not as frequent in the NHL because it seems like you have guys that spend good chunks of their career in one spot, whereas NBA players move around all the time. NFL, Major League Baseball, you still see a lot of player movement, but it seems like the more the player gives to the fans in terms of goals, highlight reel plays, even after they leave, the more the fans are willing to give back.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And for, Patrick Kane, who's, what they say, 16 seasons in Chicago, I think it wound up being, 3 Stanley Cups, an MVP season in there. you think about where the Blackhawks were as a franchise before he got there, even the years, like decade before he got there, and just, you know, he was kind of that first guy to really come in, him and Jonathan Tace together, and really bring excitement back to, Chicago again, and really made that city a hockey town now, because I think a lot of Blackhawks fans will step up and tell you, yeah, there's some passionate fans there, but it really wasn't the same energy and care for the team around there as there is, when Kane and Tace came in there. So, I think a lot of people maybe respect, just his accomplishments in Chicago, maybe more than they did, Chelios not winning a cup or anything like that. But yeah, I mean, good for Patrick Kane. And I know it's an Eastern Conference team, but boy, what a storybook run the Red Wings have been on since Kane has gotten to that team.
Just
And
completely changed them around.
yeah, an absolutely wild run for them right now. So it's going to be interesting to see if they can keep that up over in the East. But I'm sure we'll hear more about it in tomorrow's Locked On NHL podcast.
Yes, most definitely. And you talk about a big in-season acquisition, Patrick Kane for Detroit. The Colorado Avalanche are on the verge of picking up a big one themselves. This, depending on what happens with Jake Gensel from the Penguins, depending on how many teams decide that they are fully out and have big assets to move, this might be the biggest acquisition that happens between now and the trade deadline. We'll talk about exactly what the Colorado Avalanche have received to try to get themselves back up further in the Central Division standings as we finish today's episode of the Locked On NHL podcast after this. Today's episode of Locked On NHL is brought to you by Camino Consulting. You've heard of our online families and couple scores and taken advantage of the Locked On 25% discount running to the end of the month. But what about the live seminars? In both sport and business, the challenge is differentiating candidates and recruits in an endless battle. Everyone can demonstrate their measurables and qualifications, but we all know it is the intangibles that matter when those things are similar. Contact Camino Consulting for their team and management seminars to get a peek behind the curtain and watch your next recruiting class or hiring group become one of the most effective you've ever seen, both because you identified the right candidates and because you've learned how to communicate and motivate them in accord with their own preferences. But you aren't in business management or working with the new team. They pay referrals too. Make some money making your workplace and favorite teams better. Every group works together better at the end of year one than week one. So contact Camino Consulting at CaminoConsulting.ca and get on the fast track to understanding. That's CaminoConsulting.ca. CaminoConsulting.ca. One final segment of today's episode of the Locked On NHL podcast. Once again, we are your team every day. Seth Toupal and Nick Morgan, flipping now to a preview of the trade deadline, but a move that is happening before the deadline that I think, Nick, will have one of the bigger impacts of any move made before the deadline. We got reports today that Valeri Nichushkin is set to return after seeking out assistance from the player assistance program. If he can return and give the Avalanche anything close to where he has been at points in his career, this is a massive move. But before we talk about that, I do want to say, which is what we said this when it was announced that he was heading into the player assistance program. I am glad that this program exists to be able to get players that need it, the help that they need, and glad that he is at the point where he feels like he is well enough along to be able to return.
Right. Yeah, that's the biggest takeaway from out of this is we're just glad to see Valeri Nichushkin back in a good spot, and whatever he was going through, that it is taken care of enough now that he feels like he's in a good spot to come back and start playing hockey again. Now for the hockey aspect, this is a big boost for the Colorado Avalanche because when you break down the numbers and you watch the tape and you really kind of, really get into Valeri Nichushkin's game, this is probably the best he's ever looked in his entire career.
Mm-hmm.
He's playing more ice time per game than he ever has before. 42 points in 40 games he's played this year. He's on pace to break his career best in points. He's on pace to break his career best in goals. That's even with the time that he's missed. You look at Colorado and, they're in a pretty good position for the rest of the year, especially after the deadline. They do have, kind of a tough schedule, but it's certainly a doable schedule. You get Valeri Nichushkin back. There are whispers that there could be a Gabe Landeskog appearance at some point. Maybe that's a playoff conversation, but there's been talk that he might be gearing up for a return. So you look and I think you said it best when you talk about kind of equating this to a trade deadline. The Avalanche had the potential to add two big pieces for a playoff run without Joe Sakic and Chris McFarland even having to pick up a phone and call another team.
Yeah, and you look at the impact that Nichushkin had. Like, let's go back to 2021, 2022. He had 9 goals in the playoffs, 15 points in those 20 playoff games that the Avs played. So you're talking about a guy, and you're talking about a guy that can provide you a massive playoff impact too. The Avs currently in third in the Central Division, but like we said earlier this season, they have been winning games, but it just doesn't seem like they have been burying teams like they have in the past. And so you add a guy like this who, like you said, is just he's on pace to break a bunch of his previous career bests. That all of a sudden turns you from like, hey, we're the 3 seed to let's go win the division down the stretch. Like, let's go power through the month of March and April and leapfrog Winnipeg and Dallas and just win the division ourselves.
You sound like you just laid out a pretty good blueprint there for Colorado fans. It's going to be interesting because that division is an interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
Dallas has kind of jumped ahead right now, but you have Winnipeg, who, was in a little bit of a rut and now starting to turn things around. Colorado was the top dog and then I was cooled off. Somehow Nashville's still there. How they are, I don't know. I don't know if they should be there. That's a different conversation for a different podcast. But, the point being is that Western Conference, that Central Division is kind of just anybody's game at this point. And it may depend when you look at you look at the numbers and you look at the standings, it may just depend on who gets hot at the end of the year. Like who's just sort of has the hottest streak to end those last 2 weeks. That may determine who winds up with that division title. And yeah, if you're Colorado, getting those 2 guys back and getting somebody like Valeri Nichushkin, who is in the middle of a career year, that may be the thing that gives you your hot streak at the end of the year to do that.
And yeah, it could be a move that gives you the opportunity to make a deep run in the playoffs too.
Yeah,
I love this. I think this is exactly what Colorado needs. I know Gorgiev has had a good season, great season. He's also had some inconsistencies throughout the year. So if you can take a little pressure off of him by adding to your offense and just turning that into just a beyond lethal offense, that's the kind of move that can separate you. So glad he's back. Actually, as the host of Locked On Wilds, I just look at this and I am like, oh, great. Now another guy that can potentially just shred goalies down the stretch. But from the human side, very glad that he is in position to return. Just go beat like St. Louis and Nashville a bunch of times. That'd be great.
I'm not even arguing with that last one at this point.
Hey, that's fine by me. So that will do it for today's episode of Locked On NHL. Once again, make sure to hit the like button before you head out for the day. Make sure to subscribe if you have not already so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday with our wide array of Locked On NHL hosts covering everything throughout the National Hockey League, whether it be the Western Conference, the Eastern Conference, power rankings, team coverage at large. We've got you covered with new episodes all week long. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network.